June 6, 1944, Normandy coast, France. The gray dawn breaks over a churning sea. The wind lashes cold spray across the bow of a British landing craft as it bucks violently toward shore. Inside, men clutch rifles slick with seawater and sweat, their faces ghostly under the pale light filtering through gunmetal clouds. The smell of diesel, salt, and cordite hangs thick in the air. On the horizon, beyond the mist, the entire English Channel seems alive. Ships of every shape and size choke the waterline. Destroyers hammering German fortifications, troop ships disgorging landing craft, freighters towing strange, hulking silhouettes wrapped in canvas. To the soldiers inside the LCTs, it looks like the invasion of another world. 30 seconds, the coxswain yells. The ramp slams down into waist-deep surf. Machine gun fire rips the water ahead into white spouts. The men of the 2nd Battalion Essex Regiment surge forward, stumbling under weight of packs and weapons toward the chaos that would be forever called D-Day. Above them, the roar of naval guns thunders like an angry god. The sky flickers with the flash of shells, the scream of incoming mortars, the shriek of low-flying typhoons. The first hours are hell itself, but behind the storm of battle, another storm is gathering. Not of steel and fire, but of logistics. By the end of that first day, over 156,000 Allied troops have landed along a 50-mile stretch of Normandy coastline. But their foothold, miraculous as it is dangerously fragile. Everything depends on what can be brought ashore: tanks, trucks, ammunition, food, fuel, medical supplies, construction material, an entire army's lifeblood. The beaches themselves are barely more than strips of wet sand beneath cliffs and farmland. No deep-water ports, no piers, no cranes. The nearest major harbor, Cherbourg, is still in German hands, heavily fortified, its docks rigged for demolition. And if the Allies can't offload their supplies fast enough, their invasion could choke to death on its own success. That night, under the dim light of blackout lanterns, engineers, naval officers, and beachmasters gather over makeshift tables near Omaha and Gold Beach. The sand trembles with artillery in the distance. Colonel Arthur Percival surveys the shoreline, a graveyard of wrecked landing craft, burned-out trucks, and tangled steel obstacles. "We can't keep this up. We'll run dry within a week," he mutters. But then someone mentions the secret project, whispered among Royal Engineers for months, dismissed by skeptics as fantasy. Floating harbors, portable piers, a port that could be built on the sea itself. The idea had sounded absurd even to seasoned officers. You can't just float a harbor across the channel. The first storm will tear it apart. But the planners in London, under the visionary genius of Lord Mountbatten's combined operations, had already spent years preparing for this moment. Somewhere across the channel, in quiet shipyards and secret coastal workshops, massive steel and concrete structures were waiting. They had code names like Phoenix, Whale, and Spud. Hundreds of them, caissons, pontoons, floating roadways, anchors, cranes, an entire artificial harbor ready to be towed piece by piece. They would call it Mulberry. As the last traces of daylight fade, convoys begin to form on the southern English coast. Tugs stretch their cables taut, pulling colossal blocks of hollow concrete, Phoenix caissons, out into the dark. They move slowly, escorted by patrol craft, their destination carefully marked on secret maps just off the beaches of Normandy. By dawn, Allied troops on the shore will look out to sea and see a new kind of invasion, not of soldiers, but of steel, concrete, and ingenuity. The next chapter of the war won't be fought with bullets, but with bulldozers, cranes, and welders. And somewhere in Tokyo, Japanese naval attachés study intercepted reports of the Normandy landings with disbelief. They have no deep-water port. It cannot last. Without harbors, the invasion will collapse. They could not yet imagine that within days the Allies would build not one, but two of the largest harbors in the world from nothing but ocean. June 7th, 1944. The English Channel. The dawn breaks cold and pale over a restless sea. From the cliffs above Armanche, British spotters watch in astonishment as a strange procession appears on the horizon. Tugboats groan against heavy cables, hauling enormous gray blocks of concrete, each the size of a small fortress, toward the beaches of gold. At first glance it looks absurd, a convoy of floating ruins, slow as snails, guarded by corvettes and minesweepers. Yet this strange armada is the lifeline of the invasion. Each structure bears a name from a plan kept secret even from most officers. Mulberry B, the second of two prefabricated harbors designed to turn the shallow Norman coast into the busiest port on Earth. To the men hauling cargo on the beach, the meaning becomes clear only as the first Phoenix caisson reaches its destination. Naval engineers shout orders through megaphones. The caisson's flood valves open. Seawater rushes in, and the massive concrete block settles gracefully onto the seabed, forming the first link in a breakwater. Within hours, a line of these artificial islands begins. June 7th, 1944. The English Channel. The dawn breaks cold and pale over a restless sea. From the cliffs above Armanche, British spotters watch in astonishment as a strange procession appears on the horizon. Tugboats groan against heavy cables, hauling enormous gray blocks of concrete, each the size of a small fortress, toward the beaches of gold. At first glance it looks absurd, a convoy of floating ruins, slow as snails, guarded by corvettes and minesweepers. Yet this strange armada is the lifeline of the invasion. Each structure bears a name from a plan kept secret, even from most officers. Mulberry B, the second of two prefabricated harbors designed to turn the shallow Norman coast into the busiest port on Earth. To the men hauling cargo on the beach, the meaning becomes clear only as the first Phoenix caisson reaches its destination. Naval engineers shout orders through megaphones. The caisson's flood valves open. Seawater rushes in, and the massive concrete block settles gracefully onto the seabed, forming the first link in a breakwater. Within hours, a line of these artificial islands begins to stretch along the horizon. From the air, reconnaissance pilots see it take shape, a curving wall that breaks the surf, quieting the waters within. Behind it, smaller pontoons begin to appear, steel roadways nicknamed whales, supported by floating pontoons called beetles, connecting back toward the shore. Each component is a triumph of engineering, designed, tested, and built in secret across Britain. Over 400,000 tons of concrete, 85,000 tons of steel, and the labor of tens of thousands of workers had gone into the construction. Shipyards from the Thames to the Clyde had built them under code names to hide their purpose from enemy spies. The idea had come years earlier, born from desperation and imagination. In 1942, after the disastrous Dieppe raid, British planners realized they could never seize a major French port intact. Every harbor would be fortified and wired for demolition. So, the only solution was to build one from scratch. Churchill himself had scribbled the idea on a memo. "Bring me the floating piers." He demanded something that could be towed across the channel, anchored off an open beach, and capable of unloading thousands of tons of supplies per day. Many scoffed, Yet through months of experimentation, with models in wave tanks, steel prototypes in Scottish locks, and massive caissons poured in dry docks, the impossible had begun to take shape. Now, in June 1944, that gamble is unfolding before the eyes of soldiers still fighting their way inland. Major Alan Beckett, one of the engineers responsible for the floating roadways, stands knee-deep in the surf, watching a section of whale rise and fall with the tide. He wipes the spray from his glasses and mutters, "If this holds, we'll have a highway over the sea." Overhead, German aircraft dart through clouds, trying to strike the vulnerable construction sites. Flak erupts from Allied cruisers offshore. On the beaches, cranes lift prefabricated bridge sections into place. Bulldozers roar through surf to anchor the roadway's shore ends. Every hour the tide rises and falls several meters, and yet somehow the system flexes and bends with the waves. By the evening of June 8th, Mulberry A at Omaha Beach and Mulberry B at Arromanches are both taking shape. In the span of 48 hours, the Allies have created the beginnings of two deep-water harbors where days earlier there had been only sand and seaweed. Convoys begin to arrive, Liberty ships packed with trucks, bulldozers, tanks, and fuel drums. They nose up to floating piers and begin offloading directly onto waiting transporters. Each Liberty ship can unload in hours instead of days. To the astonishment of German commanders monitoring reports from Normandy, tonnage flowing ashore already exceeds their estimates. "It is impossible," one Wehrmacht officer says in disbelief. "The Allies cannot unload this much without ports." But impossible is exactly what the Allies are doing. Aboard a captured German trawler in Cherbourg Harbor, a Kriegsmarine liaison writes in his log, "Enemy ships seem to unload upon the open sea itself. Impossible constructions visible offshore. Are these pontoons or some kind of floating bridge?" By June 12th, more than 1 million men, 170,000 vehicles, and 600,000 tons of supplies have landed in Normandy. The beaches are a living organism, cranes, trucks, bulldozers, and landing craft moving in constant rhythm. Mulberry B, soon to be known as Port Winston, is becoming one of the busiest harbors in the world. In the small Norman village of Arromanches, French civilians watch as the coastline transforms before their eyes. Old fishermen stand on the cliffs, shaking their heads. "C'est un port qui flotte." It's a port that floats. But not everything is calm. To the west, off Omaha, dark clouds gather. The English Channel, which had granted the Allies safe passage during the invasion, is about to remind them who truly commands these waters. For all their genius, the Mulberries have one enemy they cannot outthink: the weather. June 9th, 1944. Arromanches-les-Bains, Normandy. The morning fog rolls in thick, turning the vast mechanical skeleton offshore into ghostly silhouettes. From the cliffs above, the sound is unlike anything heard before in war. The constant clang of steel hammers, the grind of gears, the groan of winches, the deep hum of generators. An entire harbor is being born from the sea. Down below, British Royal Engineers wade waist-deep in icy surf, guiding massive floating roadways into position. The modular bridges, code-named Whales, flex with each passing swell, rising and falling in mechanical rhythm. Bolts are tightened, cables hauled taut, anchors dropped. Cranes swing overhead like giant mantises, lowering sections of pontoon with delicate precision. Captain William Tate, a 27-year-old engineer from Birmingham, scribbles into his notebook between commands. His uniform is soaked, his face smeared with salt and grease. "We're building the world's largest harbor, and doing it in enemy waters," he mutters. Every hour brings new challenges: a broken anchor chain, a pontoon adrift, the tide stealing away an entire section of roadway before it can be fixed. Men work through exhaustion, through rain, through the rumble of distant artillery. They sleep in foxholes beside welding torches, eat cold rations on floating decks, and measure progress in meters per day. Offshore, the Gooseberry blockships, old freighters and destroyers deliberately scuttled, now form a rough breakwater. Around them, the Phoenix caissons rise from the depths like gray cliffs, each weighing thousands of tons. Together, they create an artificial calm in which ships can safely unload their cargo. By June 10th, the first ships are docking against floating piers. Jeeps roll down ramps, supply trucks clatter over steel decking, and crates of ammunition are stacked in towering rows along the beach. Naval officers cheer as the first full convoy unloads under a Union Jack, snapping in the wind. It is, by every measure, an engineering miracle, but a fragile one. The channel is deceptively calm in those first days. The tides shift gently, the wind mild, but the engineers know how quickly that can change. Every bolt, every cable, every anchor chain must hold under the worst the sea can deliver. In London, Admiral Sir Bertram Ramsay reviews status reports from Normandy. Mulberry B operating at 50% capacity and improving, one report reads. Omaha Harbor Assembly behind schedule due to congestion. Ramsay circles a line and adds in pencil, pray for weather. Meanwhile, in Tokyo, analysts within the Imperial Japanese Navy Intelligence Bureau review decoded fragments of Allied radio traffic. The reports are unbelievable. Claims that artificial harbors now stand off the French coast, capable of landing entire divisions per day. Rear Admiral Matome Ugaki shakes his head in disbelief. A harbor, built from nothing. It must be exaggeration. Storms will destroy it within a week. Back in Normandy, the work continues. At low tide, the beach stretches wide and slick, dotted with stranded landing craft. Soldiers haul crates of fuel, medical supplies, and rations across mats of steel mesh called Sommerfeld track. Bulldozers rumble inland, carving roads through shattered hedgerows. Engineers erect depots, signal stations, and repair yards right on the sand. Then, on June 11th, at Arromanches, something extraordinary happens. A convoy of Liberty ships, tugs, and barges approaches under clear skies. The lead ship, SS Derry Canoe, anchors just offshore. Lines are thrown, gangways secured. And for the first time in history, a fully loaded ocean freighter unloads directly onto a floating pier miles from any port. Jeeps drive straight off the ship, over the pontoon roadways, onto French soil. The moment is electric. Cheers erupt from the beach. Men who'd been living off K rations for days now see barrels of food, crates of ammunition, and fresh vehicles rolling inland. The lifeline has opened. But then, far to the west, the weather begins to shift. The barometer drops. A low-pressure system over the Atlantic pushes toward the channel. By nightfall on June 18th, the wind picks up, and whitecaps flicker across the darkening sea. By the morning of June 19th, the storm arrives. Waves pound the shoreline, turning calm water into chaos. Ships strain at their anchors, crashing into one another. Floating roadways twist and buckle under the force of the gale. Engineers cling to cables, trying desperately to hold the harbor together as the sea tears at their work. Captain Tate and his men lash pontoons with chains, shouting orders over the roar of the gale. Cut that line! Let it go before it drags us under! A massive steel pontoon breaks free and slams into another, splintering the walkway like matchsticks. Lightning flashes. Somewhere offshore, a Phoenix caisson cracks open, seawater rushing through its concrete hull. For 3 days, the storm rages. Mulberry A, the American harbor at Omaha Beach, takes the full brunt of it. When the weather finally clears on June 22nd, the scene is apocalyptic. Pontoon roadways lie twisted, like wreckage after an air raid. Caissons are shattered, ships grounded on sandbars, equipment strewn across miles of coastline. Engineers walk among the ruins in silence. Mulberry A is finished, reports the U.S. Naval Construction Battalion commander grimly, completely destroyed. But at Arromanches, Mulberry B has survived, damaged, battered, but standing. British engineers had reinforced its anchorage and sheltered it behind the sunken blockships. As the waves subside, the men set to work repairing every bent girder, replacing every torn cable. Within 48 hours, the harbor is operating again, at reduced capacity, but alive. What no one realizes yet is that Mulberry B, known now as Port Winston, will go on to sustain the entire Allied advance for months. Through it will flow millions of tons of cargo, enough to fuel the armies that will liberate France, Belgium, and beyond. And on the other side of the world, Japanese Naval Intelligence Bureau will receive photos and intercepted reports, images of a harbor built on open sea, surviving storms, feeding an army. For the first time, they will begin to understand that Allied industrial imagination may be their greatest weapon of all. June 20th, 1944, Normandy, France. The morning after the storm breaks cold and still, the sea a heaving graveyard of wreckage. The sun glints off twisted metal and shattered pontoons that bob like broken bones in the surf. The once mighty Mulberry A at Omaha lies in ruins, its caissons cracked, its roadways ripped apart and flung ashore by waves that rose over 20 feet. On the beach, exhausted engineers stumble through sand littered with debris, life jackets, shattered crates, a tangle of twisted girders half buried in the tide. Bulldozers churn methodically, clearing what they can. The wind carries the smell of diesel and salt, and something else, the sharp metallic tang of failure. Lieutenant Commander Harold S. Murray of the U.S. Navy Beach Battalion stands on a wrecked pontoon surveying the damage. His jaw tightens. "All gone," he mutters, voice low. "All that work gone overnight." The storm, one of the worst channel tempests in living memory, had come out of nowhere. Barometers had fallen, but forecasts hadn't warned of its ferocity. For 3 days, gale-force winds of over 60 knots smashed the coast. LSTs were hurled onto beaches like toys. Liberty ships snapped mooring lines. Pontoons vanished beneath the waves. At the height of it, sailors and engineers risked their lives to cut loose pontoons before they dragged entire pierheads into the sea. Some succeeded, others didn't. A few men were never found. At Arromanches, however, the picture is different. There, Mulberry B, the British harbor, survives. Not unscathed, but alive. Colonel Frank Stagg of the Royal Engineers had ordered double anchorage lines before the storm hit, insisting on redundant moorings for every caisson. His foresight and the protective curve of the Gooseberry blockships made the difference. When the winds peaked, the British harbor flexed and shifted but did not break. Now, under a clearing sky, work begins again. Welders spark to life along the waterfront. Cranes creak as damaged sections are hauled up for repair. Men patch holes with steel plates scavenged from wrecked roadways. Overhead, the rhythmic whine of C-47s ferrying supplies inland fills the air, a reminder that time is everything. Port Winston, as the soldiers now call it, is battered but operational. By June 23rd, within 48 hours of the storm's end, the first Liberty ship is unloading once more. The scale is staggering. Within weeks, this floating harbor will handle over 7,000 tons of cargo per day, equal to the throughput of a small city port. Tanks, trucks, artillery pieces, fuel and rations all pour through its arteries, feeding the growing armies pushing towards Caen. A sergeant of the Royal Army Service Corps writes in his diary, "We work 20 hours a day, soaked, hungry and smiling. You can almost hear the war being won through the clang of cranes. The war of logistics, quiet, relentless, is being fought and won in these waters. By July, the Mulberry's pierheads stretch hundreds of meters from shore. Ships queue in line like aircraft awaiting landing clearance. The sea inside the breakwater is calm, a lagoon of order amid chaos. Barges glide in and out, carrying jeeps and ammunition, their decks piled high. Even German aerial reconnaissance, flying at high altitude beyond Allied fighters, reports what seems impossible. Photographs show rows of ships anchored along what looks like a man-made port in the open sea. Analysts in Paris and Berlin debate what they're seeing. It cannot be real, one Luftwaffe colonel insists. The English must have captured Cherbourg already. But the truth is even more incredible. Cherbourg won't fall until late June, and when it does, German demolitions leave it useless for weeks. The Mulberry, conceived as temporary, has instead become indispensable. In London, Churchill receives the first confirmed tonnage reports. He taps the document with a cigar and grins. "A harbor that floats," he says softly. "We shall never forget the men who built it." By August 1944, as the Allied armies sweep across France, Port Winston becomes the logistical heart of Operation Overlord. More than 2.5 million men, 500,000 vehicles, and 4 million tons of supplies will eventually pass through the beaches of Normandy, much of it thanks to the surviving Mulberry. And halfway across the world, in Tokyo, a coded intelligence report reaches the Imperial Navy General Staff. Intercepted reconnaissance photographs confirm what the Japanese attachés in Berlin had dismissed weeks ago. Giant artificial harbors off Normandy, still functioning despite the Channel storms. Vice Admiral Yurunosuke Kusaka studies the images in silence. The harbor looks alien. Cranes and roadways stretching out over open water, ships docking as if against invisible shores. Finally, he murmurs, "The Americans build the sea itself." His age shifts uneasily. "Sir, could such things be made here?" Kusaka's reply is quiet, almost weary. "Not with our resources, not anymore." In that moment, far from the European battlefield, another realization begins to dawn. That the Allies' strength lies not only in their numbers or weapons, but in their capacity to create, to engineer, to imagine solutions where none should exist. Back on the beaches of Normandy, that truth is embodied in every cable, every girder, every battered pontoon that still rises and falls with the tide. As the summer sun sets over Armanche, the tide recedes, revealing the skeletal outlines of the harbor's structures, silent monuments to human determination. Seagulls wheel overhead, and the sound of cranes echoes faintly through the dusk. The sea, which tried to destroy them, now cradles them gently. August 1st, 1944, Romanches-les-Bains, Normandy. The summer sun blazes over Normandy now. The beaches that once trembled under artillery and storms are alive with motion, a thunderous ballet of industry. Trucks roar down steel ramps, cranes creak as they lift crates from the decks of Liberty ships, and the air hums with the rhythm of engines, generators, and shouts in a dozen languages. Where weeks ago the sea swallowed men and machines, it now bears an empire of steel and concrete. Port Winston, the last surviving Mulberry Harbor, the heartbeat of the Allied invasion. Atop a pierhead, Major Alan Beckett stands in oil-stained coveralls, surveying the harbor he helped design. The floating roadways, his whales, stretch out like steel serpents across the calm water, connecting ship to shore in an endless procession. He can feel the thrum of activity through the soles of his boots. Cranes loading fuel drums, jeeps rattling across pontoon bridges, the steady pulse of supply that keeps the war moving forward. He smiles faintly. "It works," he says to the young engineer beside him. "By God, it actually works." Behind him, Royal Engineers and American Seabees work side by side, tightening bolts, replacing worn anchor chains, patching pontoons scarred by months of use. The harbor never sleeps. It can't. Every hour another convoy arrives from England, ships loaded with ammunition, spare parts, food and fuel. Every minute counts. Far inland, General Montgomery's armored divisions grind through the hedgerows towards Caen and Falaise. The thunder of artillery echoes faintly even here, and every shell fired has passed in some way through this floating port. To the soldiers, the Mulberry is a miracle. To the engineers, it's a machine with a soul. The numbers are staggering. By August, Port Winston is unloading over 9,000 tons per day. Canks, half-tracks, ambulances, and the endless mountains of fuel and ammunition that feed modern war. Photographers from Life magazine capture the scene, rows of ships against an artificial skyline of cranes and causeways, sunlight glinting off wet steel. One caption reads, "The port that defeated Hitler's Atlantic Wall." And it's true. The Mulberry didn't just land cargo. It gave the Allies their momentum, their ability to sustain a continent-wide offensive. Without it, the beachheads might have starved, the invasion might have stalled, and the war might have dragged on for years. Even as new harbors open, Cherbourg repaired, Antwerp captured, Port Winston continues to work, the old veteran that refuses to rest. Engineers joke that it's like an old bulldog, beaten, patched, scarred, but still biting. In late August, with Paris liberated and the German front collapsing, the tide finally begins to turn. The Mulberry's purpose is nearly fulfilled. Supplies now flow through newly opened ports, and the old desperate need for an artificial harbor begins to fade. But its legacy is just beginning. Tokyo, early September 1944. Inside a dimly lit room at the Imperial Naval General Staff Headquarters, Rear Admiral Ryusone Kusaka reads another intelligence briefing from Berlin. Grainy aerial photographs show Allied convoys moving through an immense artificial harbor off Normandy, still operational, still expanding. He exhales slowly, setting down the report. "Gentlemen," he says to his staff, "what we are witnessing in France is the triumph of industry over ideology. We believed ports must be conquered. The Allies have proven they can be created." The room is silent. The implications are clear. Japan's island defenses, designed on the assumption that logistics would cripple any invasion, suddenly seem obsolete. "We have underestimated them," Kusaka adds quietly. "Their war is built not on conquest, but on construction." Across the Pacific, in the shipyards of San Pedro, Pearl Harbor, and Puget Sound, men and women labor around the clock, not just to build ships, but to build the very infrastructure of victory. Floating docks, mobile dry docks, pontoon barges, all born from the same mindset that conceived the Mulberries. Solve the impossible, then build it. Normandy, November 1944. The Channel air is sharp and cold again. Storms roll across the horizon as the last convoys unload at Arromanches. Much of the harbor still stands, battered but unbowed. Some caissons have cracked, others rest half-submerged, barnacle-encrusted relics of the greatest engineering feat of the war. Major Beckett walks along the empty pier as the final crews dismantle the outer sections. He runs his hand along the rusting steel, hearing echoes of the past months. The storm, the shouting, the clang of tools, the laughter of men who built a port on water and dared the sea to stop them. Nearby, a young private sketches the harbor in a small notebook. "Will they keep it, sir?" he asks. Beckett smiles faintly. "No, but someday people will stand here and wonder how it was ever done." He's right. Decades later, fragments of the Mulberry still rise from the sea at low tide, silent, barnacled monuments to human ingenuity. Post-war reflections. London, 1946. In a quiet conference room, a group of engineers and officers meet for a final debriefing on Operation Mulberry. Among them is Sir Harold Watkinson, who helped coordinate construction. He looks over faded blueprints, coffee-stained and creased from months of war. He says softly, "We never built it to last, but perhaps that's what makes it timeless." Mulberry proved that logistics could be as decisive as firepower, that imagination could alter the outcome of war. From the steel of those floating roads would come the modern age of modular engineering. Oil rigs, pontoon bridges, floating airports, disaster relief ports, all descended from the strange, miraculous harbor that once defied the sea. Arromanches-les-Bains, present day. The tide recedes, revealing the dark silhouettes of the Phoenix caissons, resting quietly beneath the surf. Children play along the sand, climbing rusted metal that once anchored the hopes of an army. Above them on the cliffs, a small museum stands, its windows overlooking the remnants of Port Winston. Inside, photographs line the walls, engineers hammering in the surf, tugs hauling concrete giants across the channel, soldiers unloading jeeps under a summer sky. A plaque reads, "From these waters flowed the road to liberation, the Mulberry Harbor, a bridge from imagination to victory." The sea laps gently against the remains, whispering its eternal rhythm, a reminder that in the summer of 1944, men once built the impossible, and in doing so, changed the course of history.